Welcome to Hospice Explained. This podcast is intended as an educational aid and is only a resource to begin to understand the end-of-life season. It is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Please always seek advice from your physician or qualified members of your healthcare team with any questions regarding a medical condition.
Hello and welcome to Hospice Explained. I'm your host, Marie Betcher. I want to invite you to join the Hospice Explained communities. I have one for patients and families, and I have one for professionals. Each of these communities are devoted to education, isolation, and mentoring. The links are in my show notes. In addition, Hospice Explained has 3 affiliates. If you use one of the links, Hospice Explained will get a small commission, so please and thank you. My affiliates are with the Death Deck and the EOL Deck, helping you to start conversations that matter. Casey Gaconio has a Death Doula School, which is a comprehensive program that will empower you to make a profound difference. And also, DNA is Love is offering Hospice Explained listeners a 5% discount. They have a menu of customized DNA-filled products for your loved ones and pets. My guest for this episode is John Wenderlein. John is currently working as a hospice chaplain in the Daytona Beach area. John has a master's in theological studies and is an ordained Southern Baptist minister. John has written 2 books and is working on the 3rd. The first, Remember Me, End-of-Life Stories as Seen Through the Eyes of a Hospice Chaplain. Number 2, Delayed Honor. And the 3rd book on COVID, where John worked as a hospice chaplain at a large hospital during this time. John's passion is to get the opportunity to speak about all the patients from over the years, as John truly believes that everyone has a life story that must be remembered. Welcome, Chaplain John, to Hospice Explained. Why don't you tell us all about yourself?
Well, I don't know how much there is to tell. I work currently as a hospice chaplain, which I adore. Hospice didn't come to me till later in my life. I am seminary trained, ordained a minister, and it wasn't until my mid-50s that I was blessed by hospice. Live in sunny California at one time, and then moved over here to Florida. I live here with my lovely bride and my little dog Yorkie. What else do you need to know?
John has written 2 books and he's working on a 3rd. Why don't we go ahead and start? We know you're a hospice chaplain. Why don't you start with your books?
Well, my books came out of a passion. I know you are a nurse, and what I find is everybody has a way that they download the day events that we live through moment by moment with our patients. And for me, over the years, Marie, I've just documented stories, not every story, but stories I felt to be unique, stories that touched my heart. And subsequently, I have hundreds of stories. And what I found was in my stories, actually the book I wrote secondly, which is called Delayed Honor. It deals with Vietnam veterans. It was really the book I wanted to write first. But sometimes, it was just so involved. There was just so much emotion in it that I wrote my first book, which was called Remember Me, End-of-Life Stories Through the Eyes of a Hospice Chaplain. And in that book, I just tell the story of how I came to understand what hospice was and how I got into the hospice, profession. And then, of course, I tell 10 or 12, I like to say unique stories about patients that I met. I'm reminded of one of them I call this man Rodney. If you ever remember a gentleman named Rodney Dangerfield, who used to be a comedian, this gentleman was so much like Rodney Dangerfield, it was scary. The second book I wrote was book called Delayed Honor. I find that we've buried a generation of soldiers from World War II. Even Korean veterans are passing away. I remember there was only 4 or 5 of them there at the beaches here a few weeks ago for D-Day, celebration of our invasion. And what's happening now because of, again, the age subsequence, the Vietnam veterans are coming into play now. And what happened with my Vietnam veterans is as I spoke to them and they were coming to resolve end of life, so much of how they were treated when they came back from the war when they came back from Vietnam at a younger age, had affected them their entire lives. The last 50, 55 years, they had suffered through, this anguish of how they were treated, and their families suffered through it too. So the book I wrote, Delayed Honors, the second book, deals exclusively with the veterans. And again, I bring stories into it. I bring real life people who I had the blessed opportunity to be with. And, I have a third book in my heart. For 2 years during COVID, I worked as a hospice chaplain at a large hospital in Daytona Beach, Florida. And I worked on the weekends. So you can imagine how busy the hospitals were during COVID. I remember the hospital had 12 floors, and 6 of the floors were just hospice floors. And you just couldn't come and go out of that hospital without, really special permission. So I documented a lot of stories. We lost a couple of nurses to COVID who worked there. There was just a lot of dramatic things. But, Marie, for me to write books and put them on paper is pretty impressive. I grew up as a young person playing a lot of sports. So I had a lot of coaches help me through a lot of things. And one thing they really didn't help me through is education. Yes, I have a master's degree, and only by the grace of God I have that. But I just can't imagine in my normal everyday life have ever done anything other than what I'm doing today, and that's being a hospice chaplain. I adore the profession.
John, I want to hear one story from each of the books you're writing. So I want to hear one story with a little more detail, always HIPAA compliant.
Sure.
About a patient. And then, of course, I want to hear a veteran story, and I want to hear an in-hospital story, and it can be about whichever people you pick, but I really love to hear some stories.
Well, I have 300 or 400 or 500 probably stories on my computer to date. I'm going to put another one on there that I met a gentleman a few days ago, and I'm going to put him on my computer. Seen many more people than that in my career, but there's just so many, I believe in my heart that everybody without exception has a life story. And without exception, our life stories should be told, must be told. So the next person can better understand, what's coming. But I can start with my first story, which I think is unique. First of all, I know you said you're a nurse. I think the world of nurses, I've always been impressed that a nurse can look at the vital signs of a person and say, it's coming, it's getting close. And with that, I actually once in a while, Marie, will have patients who decide they don't need a chaplain. They just choose not to have me come by. I was doing home visits at the time, but I've always had a running understanding with my nurses that if they come across the moment in their lives or in their patients' lives that they need me to just show up, then call me. I don't care, just call me. So I had one of those situations here a few years ago. I was traveling down the road to see a patient, and I got a call from, again, a very respected nurse. And of course, I deal with 5 or 6 nurses on my team, and to me, they're all pretty fascinating. But she had called me and she said, I have a patient I'm visiting now. Her name is Agnes. And of course, I've changed the name to protect the patient and protect this, but the stories are all real and true.
Sure.
But I said, okay, what's going on? Well, she's close, and, can you stop by her and see her? Well, I knew that I had time between seeing the patient that was on our service and go to see Agnes. So off I went. I turned around. I went to Agnes's house. I was greeted at the door by a daughter-in-law, and she had been crying. And I had said, sweet lady, why are you crying? And I just knew why she was crying, but she was silent, and she walked me up a flight of stairs. At the very end of the hall, or very end of the room, was this small, petite, little lady in one of those granny nightgowns that you can only get from Grannies R Us. I mean, I never know where these sweet ladies get these little gowns at, but I think my mother had one, and I think my wife's looking for one. But there she was, sitting in this big, monstrous recliner, and her head was forward, and she was sleeping. So I walk in, I say hi to my nurse, and I walk over, and there's a little end table next to the sweet lady. So I move the end table all the way, and I sit down on the floor. Now, I've always been a patient I've always been a chaplain or a pastor who feels like he has to touch. So I reached out and grabbed her little hand and I put it in my hand, and she had a little old hand compared to my monstrous hands. So I'm sitting on the floor next to a recliner, and I put this sweet lady's hand in mine, and she briefly wakes up and looks over, and I go, "Hello, sweet lady, how are you tonight?" And she goes, "Is it time yet?" And I paused for a second and I said, "Is it time yet?" And she said, "Yes, is it time yet?" And I said, "Well, is it time for you and me to go dancing? Or are you going to go cooking?" I made light of what she was asking because I knew what she was asking. Marie, she said, "I'm just so tired. Are you here for me?" I said, "Well, I am here for you, but I'm here to love you up." Daughter-in-law said that you might enjoy a visit. And she was constantly nodding on and off, while I was visiting with her. And the daughter-in-law was still having tears, and even my nurse was getting a little emotionally involved. And I talked briefly to the sweet little lady, probably for the next 5 or 6, 8 minutes. She had told me she had buried her husband and her only son had passed away, which of course was the husband of the daughter-in-law who took it upon herself to take care of this sweet lady at the end of her life. And I said, "Yeah, I know, life." She said, I just don't know why I'm around anymore." I said, "Well, you're around, so I get a chance to meet you." I said, "I believe with all my heart that the Lord still has something planned for you, or you wouldn't be here." So, like I said, we talked a little while, and she fell back asleep. So I sat there for a while with my hand clutching her hand. And it was funny, Marie, something, and again, I'm not a doctor and I'm not a nurse. But I looked over at my nurse and I said, "Kathy, I think she's gone. I think she's left us." And sure enough, she was gone. She had left. She had, I tell people she'd gone to the big zip code in the sky. And, that story is not an uncommon story. I can give you 4, 5, 6 other stories like that I deal with, on a momentary basis.
What do you feel? Do you feel like, is there something you say that you feel like gives peace to people that you can share with my audience?
Well, sincerity is what it's all. I believe in all my heart. Sincerity is what it's all about. It cannot be a profession. It has to be a lifestyle. It has to be something that you believe in, something that you stand with. For me, I said nothing differently or did nothing differently that I wouldn't have done for anyone that I care for. Anyone. I had a sweet patient tell me one time, she said, "Why do you keep coming and visit me?" She was a real stout, 99-year-old, hard, hard Democrat. That's all I can say. And I said, "Well, you know what? I come to see you because I love to see you." And she said, "Why do you keep asking me if I'm in pain?" And I paused for a few seconds, which always seems like minutes. And I said, I ask you if you're in pain because I love you too much for you to be in pain." And her countenance changed. In the next 6 or 7 months that we spent time together, eventually she succumbed to her failing heart. But we got to be close friends, and her and I were able to talk about things that she'd probably never talked about in the 99 years that she'd been on this earth. I don't think I believe the Lord has an appointed time. I believe we have an appointed time. I believe the Lord gives us the passion and the desire to live a full life. Live as if we're going to be 1,000,000 years old, and let Him figure out all the small details of when He's coming to get us. And it just happened to be, not by chance, because I don't believe in chance, that the Lord put me in that sweet lady's house at that moment, maybe to gather a little bit of peace, her a little bit of peace. But I have to say, with every with every patient I meet, I walk away better for it. I walk away with a different insight. It's such a blessing that I'm able to come into people's lives at the end of their lives with all the dynamics, as you can imagine, and all the interpersonal, family, whatever scroffling that's going on, and be able to play a part, in their life and in their passing.
And I think you're correct in the way you say it. There's not a coincidence, but a lot of folks end up being very comforted by the different visits that the staff makes, and we do our very best, those that are working in the profession, to get the folks comfortable and peaceful as we can possibly can.
Absolutely. I had a patient this morning. I went to visit a new patient. I walked into her room and, she's at that 10%, that 15% of, functionality. She's not going to be around long. And there was a panic in her, and she was, as best I can explain it, she was breathing in and out very heavily and very sporadically. And her eyes were fixed and glazed over. And I walked over and I put my hand out, and she grabbed my hand with both her hands. And I said, "Sweet lady, it's going to be okay." I said, "I'm here to visit you, and how can I make it better?" And within a minute or so, she just shut down and stopped that crazy breathing, that sporadic, that panic, the breathing that she had, and she just relaxed. Now, when she relaxed, she went right back to sleep, because that's where she was at this point. Sometimes the medications we give patients at the end of life are so strong that they're not really conscious. They're just not able to have much conversation.
I do feel, though, John, that, and this is not always the case, but for the most part, I do believe that they are, if they're not awake and they're having that breathing trouble or they're having a lot of pain, then sleeping is okay. They're comfortable at that point.
That's absolutely true. I tell my caregivers, I tell family members that even though they might appear to be unconscious, that they still need to continue to talk to them because they can hear.
Absolutely.
And that's why I'm pretty primarily in nursing homes, nursing care, and you'll find that if a patient doesn't have any family, that often they will turn on a radio or they'll turn on a TV and leave it on while the patient is, succumbing to, whatever illness they have, because that noise, that conversation just keeps them focused. So I believe that with all my heart. I absolutely agree with you.
Thank you. No, I'm glad to hear that, but I'm not surprised either. Well, John, I want to hear a veteran story. Honestly, I want to hear at least one good veteran story on how, maybe they found peace after so many years of the emotional duress. Hello, audience. I just want to pause and thank all of our members of the armed forces and those who have done service for our country. Thank you so much. And I do want to pause and give you a trigger warning for this next story from Chaplain John. Thank you.
Well, I tell you, we live in a world where when our soldiers came back from Vietnam after being drafted, and now, the government will say, well, most of them volunteered. Well, they volunteered because somebody had told them if they volunteer, they might get a better stay of duty. In fact, there was a buddy system back then that if you went into the service with your buddy, the odds are you two could go and serve together. Well, of course, they would tell you just about anything. I had a patient that I relate in the story in my book. He was in Vietnam. I had met him probably the last 3 months of his life. And he'd been in nursing care for a while at the VA. And on the wall was a picture of what looked to be him younger and 12 other guys. And they were in fatigues. And this evidently, I found out later, was Vietnam. But what I found out was one day when I came to visit him, and when I deal with veterans, we like to give them honor and give them a certificate and a pinning and recognize their service. But this gentleman had served in Vietnam, and he was a sergeant. He was on patrol as he tells the story. I tell people it's like a John Wayne movie. In the way in which he told the story, it was like I was with John Wayne in an old Iwo Jima movie or something. But he says we were on patrol. We were coming back to encampment, and we had passed over rice paddies, and rice paddies have 2 or 3 or 4 feet of water in them. And we were waiting, heading back to camp, and all of a sudden there was gunfire, and it caught them all off guard. Well, it was an ambush, and they were being shot at in every direction. They were being shot at. And, when he's telling the story, this is a man probably 50 plus years ago this happened. But, it was just as real today for him as it was for the moment today that he was telling it. And he said, here was these bullets going by. He said, I was in a panic. He said, but all of a sudden I was in the water. And I kept saying to myself, I need to get up. I've got to return fire. But, he didn't know he had been shot in the back. He didn't know that. He said, I kept trying to get up and I just couldn't get up. So subsequently, he says, Chaplain, and of course he is just beside himself by now. And he says, Chaplain, I didn't realize it. He said, but eventually the enemy he saw in the corner of his eye, they thought everybody had been killed. And he says, the enemy started stripping off all the uniforms of these men, and they started to either shoot or bayonet. And he says, I remember thinking, well, I'm going to die. And he said, what came through my mind was my new bride, my new wife, and the fact that she was pregnant and she was going to have a baby. And he said it was funny. Here I am trying not to drown because I have no control over my body, which I haven't figured out why yet. And he says, I'm worried about my wife and my baby. And, sure enough, they came to him, and he said he remembers them flipping him over on his back. And evidently, after they medevaced him out of this situation, he had been bayoneted a couple times in his back. And he said, it took me months. It took me months to recover from this, this event. And he said one other fellow soldier lived through it. Everybody else was killed. I said, but, we talked about it. And I said, quite honestly, Charlie, it's what you've just told me is unbelievable. And I can only imagine it through a John Wayne movie. And that's why I reference it in the book. I said, so what did you do next? He said, well, I kind of recovered. I got better. It took me about 6 months. And he said, they shipped me out. And, back then we had to wear our uniforms. We wore uniforms wherever we went. Of course, my father was Navy, and I understood. If you were service, you wore your uniform just about everywhere, unless you weren't doing service. So remember, he caught a local plane to go home. And on that plane was another soldier. Now, he was in the Army, and this gentleman was a Marine. And they just happened to sit close to each other, so they kind of gathered up. And as they flew home, they were having conversation. And they flew into L.A., which I've been to L.A. In the 70s. I lived out in California for a while, so I know how big that airport is. He said, so we got off the plane, and we were walking the long walk to go where I needed to get picked up and take a taxi to go, to my wife and my child who'd been born. And in the middle of all this was a group of protesters, and didn't think anything of them. And as I got closer to them, they started to spit upon us. They started to call us all kinds of horrid names. And they started to call us, baby killers and all the things that they were. And he said, I immediately thought, I'm not no baby killer. I don't know what they're talking about. But he said it was funny because the Marine that he was with, that he'd only met and had known for a few hours, they tried to avoid this group, but this group actually, he says, attacked them. So he remembers that he had to fight off these people with signs, and he remembers the Marine that he was with, he said, went crazy. And he said he was beating these people maliciously. They wound up getting away and getting into the bathroom, and they wound up cleaning each other, getting cleaned up. He said, but I had done nothing wrong but serve my country. I had been drafted. He said, I had been shot and horribly wounded. And he said, here were these people who treated me so horribly. But Marie, honestly, those are the stories time and time again I heard from veterans who came home and have suffered through this. At the time we had movie stars, a particular movie star, going and having photo ops with the enemy, while men like John McCain were captive in the Hanoi Hilton as an officer. He was, captive in that place for, I forgot how many years, going through horrible treatment. And we had our actresses at the time going over there and calling American soldiers horrible names and posing with the soldiers. So when they came home, majority of these veterans never got the honor that was due them. Never got the honor that was due them. I'm always reminded, Marie, of Abraham Lincoln. I'm a minor historical nut. I thought maybe I was going to teach history out of college. And I remember, Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address, just a few weeks before he was shot by a booth in the sports theater. And he said at the end of his second inaugural address, he said, if you want to know, now this was after the Civil War had ended, of course. And he said, if you want to know the tragedies of war, ask a soldier or his wife, or excuse me, ask a soldier or his children or his widow, and they'll tell you exactly the horrors of war. So, and the stories were different, situations were different in these men's stories, but the outcome was always the same. They had suffered again all these years without someone saying, attaboy, thank you. So that's what caused me to write my book, Delayed Honor. And of course, it was my second book. I wanted it to be my first, but there was just so much emotion in it that I had to take a little while to sort through it.
Well, John, thank you for doing that and honoring those people that serve. That is really kind of you to do that. I think it's it's our honor to hear about this story, and hopefully people will want to read that book. It sounds like all of your books are going to be worthy reads, to be honest. I love stories. I think it's hard, and it's not like we're done with it even.
No.
But why don't we go ahead and share a story of your time when you worked during COVID? Maybe share a story that you were just able to help connect people. I mean, do you have something like that?
Absolutely.
Hello again, audience. I just want to mention that the next stories with COVID can be difficult also to hear. And again, just a trigger warning. Thanks for listening.
I have multiple stories. My first and quickest story was, again, I worked as a hospice chaplain, PRN on call at a large hospital during COVID, at the heart of COVID. And I found that over the weekend, they would give me a place to stay and, they gave me the meal tickets. And anyway, I stayed over the weekend at this hospital. And I remember them calling me about 2:00 in the morning. And they said, Chaplain, can you come? We're going to disconnect. We're going to disconnect somebody. And it was the time, Maria, if you remember, you couldn't even get in a hospital. I remember the hospital in Kissimmee, Florida, when they called me there when COVID had just come and got to be strong. And here was a big, major hospital that had nobody in the parking lot. Every entryway was blocked by a police officer's car, and you only could come and go with passes and permission. But they called me early in the morning and said, we're going to disconnect, and I went to the room. And as I walked in the room, a sweet, sweet nurse, actually a traveling nurse, was there. And he was a sweet, sweet man. And he said, yes, Chaplain, we're going to let him go. We couldn't get the family involved, but what we've done is we've set up a Zoom meeting with a family. And of course, that was done a lot. That was done a lot during COVID. That and the fact that just on a side note, when I was in nursing care, I would have metal chairs set up outside the glass windows of nursing home rooms so the families could come and the curtains could be pulled away and they could have some kind of fellowship, even if they had to speak loudly, so through the glass. But anyway, they had called me and I walked into the room and, Marie, I saw this sweet man who was, late 70s, 80s, whatever he was. And he had a certain stereotypical look about him that when I looked at him, I just knew instantly that he was a man of Jewish faith. He had a look. Of course, I know that sounds funny, but I also knew what his last name was. And I did draw some conclusions. And then, after talking to the nurse for a few minutes, they said, okay, we're ready for Zoom. And they turned the Zoom on. And there was two young men. I say young, they were in their 30s. Of course, now that I'm in my 60s, that's kind of relative. And then there was two younger ladies with them, and that was the wives. And you could just see the tension on those two young men's face. You could just see honestly, you could just see the heartbreak. And, I stood next to the bed of this sweet man who I didn't know. And I reached out and grabbed his hand, and I stroked his brow. And I said, hey, everybody, how are you this early morning? And they paused for a second, and they said, well, we're doing okay, Chaplain. I said, I understand it's not a good day. I understand it's not a good night. But, we've come to honor your daddy. I said, knowing that he was a particular faith, understanding that at any rate, I said to the young man, I said, was your father a man of faith? Now, I ask that question a lot because if faith plays a part, I want to, more move towards that. If faith doesn't play a part, I don't move any closer when it comes to conversation, except to, tell them it's going to be okay. And they said, "Yo, yeah, he was a man of faith." And I said, "Oh, what faith did he practice?" And, these two young men, they paused and they paused and they paused. And finally, one of the men said, "We're Jewish," as if it was, we're lepers. It was just that whole verbiage that I said, "Oh, you're Jewish. How wonderful. How wonderful." I said, there are 4 people in this room. Of course, I was talking about the 2 boys, the father and myself. And I said, it's nice to know that we all love the same God. Some of us might be confused about Jesus Christ, but that really doesn't matter today. What matters is that we honor your Father. And, I could see the countenance in these 2 young men's face change. They realized that if they were going to give this responsibility to somebody, they felt more comfortable with me because it wasn't a social issue. It wasn't a Jewish only issue. It wasn't a Christianity issue. It wasn't a Jesus or God issue. It was that I cared for his father, their father. And, when I prayed before they disconnected, I prayed in the name of God. I didn't pray in the name of Jesus because that gave him the respect that was due him. And, I learned a lot that night from the doctors, and I learned a lot from that nurse on how all this is done, how they disconnect. Because as you know, with COVID, any long-term medications or medication time needed, they paralyze the person. And of course, they do that with a machine. So I learned a lot that night. But I think the most important thing I learned was that I needed to leave this religious attitude, not that I've ever had it, at the door, and just focus on the family and focus on the patient, which to me is the only reason I'm there, as far as I'm concerned.
Right. I believe that, to give comfort. That's my whole goal.
Yes,
Bring somebody comfort and peace,
absolutely.
because I want everybody to be not suffering as much. That's why I bring my podcast.
Tell another quick little story. We lost 2 nurses at that hospital at the time. One of the nurses was a gentleman I knew very well, professionally well. I saw him every weekend, and he came down with COVID. And he actually was right across from the hallway that I slept down at the end of. There was a little apartment room down at the end. So as I walked out to my door, the glass panel that covered his room was always there. And I was always able to watch him. So I would come out and I would look at him through the glass, and then I would pray. And I would leave. Well, they called me about, again, midnight, 1 o'clock, and said, he's passed away. He didn't make it. Well, I was saddened, and I said, well, if there's, of course, anything I can do, please call on me. Well, a couple hours later, they called me and said, Chaplain, we're going to move the body. That we've got to move him from the hospital to, funeral home, funeral services. Can you come out? I said, well, don't ask. Of course I can. So as I walked out the floor, out of my room, onto that floor, the 4th floor there at the hospital, there at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I do not exaggerate when I say there must have been 150 people in that hallway. And I said, what in the world's going on? These people who had worked with him, who loved him and cherished him, knew that he was going to be taken from that hospital to funeral services, and they wanted to be there. So they lined up the hallway, both sides, and the 2 men who had come for his body were walking down the hallway. And as they got close to me, I stopped and put my hand on, the gurney and said, I want to say something. And everybody stopped, and I got in the middle of the hallway, and I said, there can never be a greater example of love than tonight. That this man, who probably was I think he was in his early 50s, I said, we'll never be able to explain. I said, but what a wondrous thing it is that we've come together and just said goodbye and loved this man. And there wasn't a try house in the hallway.
I just want to say, John, that I've had the experience of working in the hospital and seeing experiences that, it takes your breath away. I just want to pause and give honor to the medical staff and what the unsung heroes in some ways, in a different sort of hero that we have been. And I just think that was wonderful that you were able to stop and honor that nurse in that moment.
Absolutely.
I just appreciate you so much, John. I would like to tell you that I would like you to come back on Hospice Explained when you have finished your next book.
Okay.
I know you just said you have over 500 stories on your computer. I think you need to start writing a few down that my audience will like.
I would absolutely love to. I have, my passion is, I'm getting to the age where I'm contemplating retirement because, that's what we do. We decide at a certain age we're going to retire. But my passion is to load me, my wife, and my fifth wheel and my little Yorkie, and get the opportunity to go places and just tell stories.
So, John, thank you for being on Hospice Explained, and you are coming back to tell more stories when your next book is done, or when you're done writing it and you've got a few more stories to tell. How's that sound?
Sounds wonderful, Marie. I tell you, it's been a blessing to have conversation with you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining me on Hospice Explained. Think about ways you can make a difference in someone's life. Also, please subscribe and share this podcast with anyone who would benefit from listening. Thank you.